A person wearing a tan ranger hat and gray uniform shirt stands at a podium holding a microphone. Behind them is a banner reading Department of AG and U.S. Forest Service with moss-covered backdrop elements visible.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tent of Many Voices. The Tent of Many Voices is part of the Core of Discovery 2 Traveling Lewis and Clark exhibit. It's a multi-agency federal exhibit, the lead agency being the National Park Service. As I said, it's a traveling exhibit. It started back in January of 2003. It's been traveling since then, and will travel through 2006, during the 4 years of the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And what we do here in the Tent of Many Voices is we bring in a wide variety of presenters to share with us different perspectives, different voices, both voices and perspectives on the Lewis and Clark expedition, and voices and perspectives from those various American Indian nations that have been living there for thousands of years before Lewis and Clark came along. And this afternoon, we're going to hear from Germaine White, who's part of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And she's going to share some of the history of her people and their connection to the Lewis and Clark expedition. So let's please give Germaine a warm welcome.
A person in a ranger hat and uniform stands holding a microphone on an outdoor stage. Another person stands at a wooden podium behind them. A banner reads Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service, and other government departments.
To the Tent of Many Voices.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today to visit with you a little bit about a tribal perspective on the Lewis and Clark expedition. As many of you know, much that's known about the Lewis and Clark expedition has been written, but for the tribal perspective. So today I'd like to share with you a little bit of information that was told to us by our elders who heard from their ancestors, these stories. So our story begins on September 4th, 1805. A large band of Salish Indians was camped at a place called Kootenai, a large gathering place. We now know it as Ross's Hole in the Bitterroot Valley. On that day, the people were gathering chokecherries because it was fall, it was September. That was the time to gather chokecherries and pound them and dry them and prepare them for the winter stores of food. The people were camped there. Not only were they gathering chokecherries, but they were also pasturing their fine horses on the abundant grasses that grew right there in the high valley at the base of the Pintler Mountains. There were over 30 camps, over 400 people, and over that number of horses that were there at that time. It was a wonderful time of warm days and cold nights in that high valley at the base of the Pintlers in the Bitterroot Valley. While the people were camped there a few days prior, the scouts had seen a group approaching. They brought the information back, and there was discussion about this band of travelers that were clearly strangers. They appeared to be a defeated war party. They looked as if they were ill and they were hungry. They were very pale. Many of their horses were lame. And there was a great deal of discussion among the leaders, among the elders and the leaders of the tribe, about whether or not they constituted a threat to the well-being of the people and should be eliminated. There were many of those in the camp that said, look at them, they're ill. They're wandering around, they're lost. They present a threat to the well-being of the people. There were those among the Salish that said, look at them, they're pitiful. They're lost, they're hungry.
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt speaks at a wooden podium bearing a seal. A water bottle sits nearby on the podium. The background is dark fabric.
Animals are lame. They're pitiful. We need to help them. They're strangers, they're passing through. This much they knew about them. There was a great deal of discussion, and it was decided by the leaders and the elders that they would provide them assistance. Now, in most non-Indian accounts of history, that's where the history of Montana begins. However, Lewis and Clark were entering a world much older than they could have ever possibly imagined. They were entering a world where people had lived a happy and contented life, where they had subsisted on the natural bounty of the landscape around them. There really was no opportunity for them to understand the depth of relationship between people and the landscape. What Lewis and Clark entered, what that band entered at that time, reaches back to the very earliest beginnings of human history on this landscape. Most of our stories tell about the making of this place fit for humans who are yet to come. Our traditional stories are coyote stories, and they tell about the landforms that were made, about the resources that were there, and most of those places have Salish names. Linguists say that these names are the oldest names in our language. In English, we call them archaic words. Some examples are Phillipsburg. We no longer use burg in common English. It's a remnant of an archaic word. We don't use Stevensville, or we still say Stevensville for a town on the west side, but we no longer use ville in common language. So place names are the oldest words in our language, and they describe the landscape and the tribe's relationship with the landscape. There are places like Timsimhli in the Bitterroot Valley, or No Salmon, a place that we now know as Lolo. There's another place in the Bitterroot Valley like Kootenai, the Great Gathering Place, or Ross's Hole. Another place in the Bitterroot Valley that has a place name describes a coyote story. It's the place of the Sleeping Child, or Sleeping Child Hot Springs now. It's interesting because many of these place names describe a very ancient landscape. And the coyote stories talk about the seasonal battle between warm and cold and the final.
A person in a light blue shirt stands at a wooden podium with a seal emblem, speaking into a microphone. A water bottle and paper sit on the podium. A black backdrop is visible behind them.
Establishment of the seasonal regimes we know now. And it's curious because most of the stories that are told very closely resemble the geological formations, the Ice Age, Glacier Lake Missoula, and the final seasonal regimes we know now, the animals that we have presently. Most archaeologists date that time to about 10 to 12,000 years before present. Interestingly enough, there's been a significant amount of archaeological excavation done at the confluence of the Clark's Fork and the Flathead River, really in the heart of our homeland. And those test sites have also been dated to about 10 to 12,000 years. So for Salish people, this was a landscape that the explorers entered, that tribal people had had a relationship with for a very long period of time. And I think that maybe the expedition had no way of really understanding that relationship between people and place. In many ways, the early descriptions of the landscape that the expedition entered was called a wilderness. You know, sometimes they describe it as a virgin wilderness, and actually it was not a wilderness. It was a land that was occupied and that was known by the people. It was known quite intimately. And the stories that we have really talk about, as I said, how long we've been here and the depth of relationship and the understanding of the landscape. Lots of folks in Montana have been here multi-generations, lived on the family farm, and understand about what it's like to know a place for multiple generations. But for Salish people, their relationship with the Bitterroot Valley was really closer to 10 or 12,000 years of relationship. So sometimes we hear Lewis and Clark called the core of discovery, and they were really less discovering than entering a very old landscape. The landscape they encountered was abundant and it was pristine. It was a landscape that I think early explorers couldn't understand in many ways, because they really felt that the people they encountered there just didn't have the sophisticated technology to destroy the landscape, where in reality, tribal values are for maintenance of a landscape. We're taught from the very earliest ages yet today to never take more than we need, to never waste anything we take, and always ensure that there's an abundance.
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a circular seal, holding papers and speaking into a microphone. A water bottle sits on the podium. A dark curtain backdrop is visible behind them.
For future generations, and in that way, tribal people for thousands of years lived a sustainable way of life on the land. The Salish people that lived in the Bitterroot Valley are the most interior band of Salish-speaking people. At one time, we were a very large Salish family. There were many tribes, and we lived in the entire northwest of the United States. Over time, as our numbers grew, in order not to exceed the resources on the land, more bands traveled further and further apart. But for us, the most interior band of Salish-speaking people, we have many relatives that live to the west of us, toward the coast. So there are Spokanes, Coeur d'Alenes, Kalispels, Colvilles, Okanagans, and many other Salish-speaking people. The territory we occupied was an extraordinary large territory. So not only did the people have experience on the land of great time depth, we also had experience on the land in a very extensive region of the Northwest. The tribes followed a seasonal way of life. They gathered the abundance of the land that was available. We gathered, beginning in the spring, our earliest food was bitterroot, followed by camas. In the summer, we visited friends and celebrated and picked berries and dried them and stored them for future use. We also had fall hunts over into these areas, into the plains part of the state, into the Great Falls area, into the Three Forks area. There were winter camps that were based there as well. So the tribes had an extraordinarily long time depth and also a very vast expanse of territory they had a relationship with. So Lewis and Clark, when they stumbled into Kootenai, were really were less than discoverers. They were really visitors for a very short period of time. And I like to talk about the time depth of people because it really, for us, it puts the Lewis and Clark expedition, it helps us put the Lewis and Clark expedition in a tribal perspective. So if you think about, let's imagine 12,000 years of occupancy on the land, and imagine that as a 24-hour day, and take that 10 to 12,000 years, wrap it around a clock for a 24-hour day. What that means is
a person in a light blue shirt stands at a wooden podium with a circular seal, speaking into a microphone. A water bottle sits nearby on the podium. The background is dark.
That Columbus arrived at about 10:59 p.m. on that day in the world of the Salish people, and Lewis and Clark arrived at about 11:37 p.m. less than 24 minutes before midnight. So there was a great deal of time that the tribes had in this place before the expedition, and a great deal of history in the state and in our region before the visitors and strangers came among us. In the period just preceding the expedition, there were significant changes. There were changes that happened rapidly and dramatically. One of the first changes that happened was between the 1600s and the 1700s, and that was the introduction of horse. We acquired horse from our occasional allies to the south of us, the Shoshone people, and it had a profound impact in our way of life. We were one of the first people in this region to have horse, and it extraordinarily expanded our territory, our mobility, our ability to hunt, our ability to continue our way of life. It was an extraordinary benefit to the people to have horse. And naturally, our enemies, the Blackfeet to the north of us, had not acquired horse yet. So if you think about the power differential among people that occasionally had conflicts over competing resources, when you imagine that Salish people had horse before any of the people in the region, the power differential was tipped way in favor of the Salish people. As I said, it provided greater mobility, easier access to buffalo, to hunting, and all of the other foods and materials that we needed. However, because it expanded the territory, it meant that there was greater conflict between tribes and as they competed over resources in lands that were overlapping Aboriginal territory. So about the time that this extraordinary gift, the horse, arrived among us, there was also something else that came among us that had a very different impact. As I said, the people lived a life that was rich with the abundance, but rarely did they have contact with strangers. So they had not acquired immunity to European diseases. And
a person in a light blue shirt stands at a wooden podium with a seal, looking down at papers. A water bottle and microphone are on the podium. Black fabric hangs behind them.
Smallpox arrived, and particularly smallpox among all of the diseases had a devastating effect among the people. Some people say that 5 to 7 out of every 8 people died in a camp as a result of smallpox. Historic demographers say that by about 1800, the numbers of Salish people declined from perhaps 40,000 to anywhere between 15 and 5,000. It had a profound impact, but it didn't just impact the Salish people. It impacted people all across the Northwest and all across the region, because we lived in communities that were very homogeneous. We lived together. We didn't abandon our ill or our elderly, and we lived in communities. So what happened was that when disease came into the community, it spread like wildfire. It's just like when my daughters were at home, it seemed like one of the girls would bring home the flu just after school started, and then my second daughter would get the flu, and then pretty soon their father would get the flu, and then, they'd all be up and on their feet, and I'd get the flu. Well, mercifully, we're able to sustain, we're able to get by, even though we get occasional flu. But with smallpox, there was really no resistance, and the people died in huge numbers, more than the people could grieve and bury individually. It had a profound, devastating effect on the tribes. One of the other significant changes that happened during this time, just prior to the expedition, was an interesting part of history. Hudson Bay established I'm trying to remember the name of the fort. Some of you historians probably know this. Buckingham House on the Saskatchewan River at about 1870. And prior to that time, people had learned about non-Indian people. They knew that there were white people, but very few of our people before Lewis and Clark had had direct experience with non-native peoples. The Hudson Bay Company had a profound effect on us at Buckingham House because they began to trade firearms with the Blackfeet people, our traditional enemies, as a consequence of our conflict over competing resources and territory. It significantly shifted the power differential again because when
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a seal, raising their left hand while speaking into a microphone. A water bottle sits nearby on the podium. The background is dark.
they acquired firearms nearly 10 to 20 years before us, that had a dramatic effect. So there were huge impacts and enormous changes to the tribal world. The Lewis and Clark expedition was sent by, as many of you know, sent by President Thomas Jefferson. And he stated that in the instructions he gave to Meriwether Lewis, President Jefferson said, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and to find the best water route to the Pacific Ocean for the purposes of commerce." So these guys were really on a business trip. They came looking like a military expedition, but they were really on a business trip, and they were there to catalog and prepare to appropriate tribal resources. So for many tribal people, the arrival of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the subsequent changes that occurred after that are really a dark part of our tribal history. They established a groundwork, the groundwork for significant changes that happened to tribal people, and a fundamentally different way of life that resulted from all of the changes that came after the Corps of Discovery. And I don't mean to disparage any great American heroes, but I really do want to provide what I believe is a balanced and honest and accurate telling of the story that remains to be told, and that's the tribal perspective. The Salish people were really unaware of the Lewis and Clark expedition's full objectives. It was difficult for them to know. The explorers spoke English. They had French-speaking interpreters. One of the interpreters spoke to his wife, who understood French and spoke Shoshone. And there was a small boy among the Salish that spoke Shoshone, and he translated the Shoshone to Salish. So imagine what happened when communication went through that many iterations of translation. I'm guessing that very little was understood. I would guess that there was significant miscommunication and great misunderstanding among the people. The results might have been very different. In terms of misunderstanding, one of the greatest misunderstandings, I think, occurred when the expedition arrived, and the people offered them blankets. They had no blankets. They appeared to be cold. Their skin was kind of blue and white, and so they offered them blankets. And when the expedition arrived, they
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a seal, gesturing while speaking into a microphone. A water bottle and papers sit on the podium. A black backdrop hangs behind them.
put them down on the ground and sat on them, and the people were very confused because they had offered these gifts to them, and they chose to sit on them. It was one of the first examples of communication, but miscommunication. But as I said, the people had determined that they would be generous to these strangers that appeared to be lost. So the expedition clearly had need of horses, and we had an abundance of beautiful, what Clark described as elegant horses. The stock was exhausted, some of them were lame, and so the expedition gave them 7 horses in exchange for 10 or 12 of the elegant horses that the Salish people had. They also, and this is going to be really important to the Lewis and Clark expedition a little bit further on down the trail. They didn't know the trail, so they were provided an escort. They were shown on to the over Lolo Pass to go and meet among the Nez Perce people. The Salish also gifted the Lewis and Clark expedition with valuable food stores that had taken countless hours to prepare. They gave them dried meat, they gave them roots, they gave them berries, they gave them food that would sustain them, and it would take countless hours to replace them, as well as the hides they were given to keep themselves warm on their trip over the pass. As they began traveling over the pass, they encountered every hardship that could be imagined, as the explorers said. Lewis wrote after his return, most fortunately, on our way within the mountains, we met with the traveling band they were Salish people, going to the plains of the Missouri in quest of buffalo, and obtained from them an accession of 7 horses to our former stock, exchanging at the same time 10 or 12 to great advantage. This ultimately proved of infinite service to us, as we were compelled to subsist on horse beef and dogs previous to our arrival in the navigable part of the Kuskoski. I have not the leisure at this moment to state all those difficulties which we encountered in our passage over these mountains. Suffice it to say, we suffered everything cold, hunger, and fatigue could impart. So clearly,
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a microphone, speaking. A water bottle and papers sit on the podium. A black backdrop hangs behind, with a circular emblem visible on the front of the podium.
The horses that were gifted to them were of huge benefit, not just for transportation, but for food as well as they traveled. Clark also echoed the words of Lewis at about this time. I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for us to discuss this encounter between the Salish people and the Lewis and Clark expedition. I'm just going to conclude by saying that many of the leaders were greatly angered and hurt by the subsequent events that happened after the Lewis and Clark expedition. There was a great concern that the kindness of the people had been exploited, the welcoming and the generosity of the people had been used, and the people had been treated somewhat badly. This was an ancient landscape, and the people had a great relationship with the land and a huge fondness for the land, and yet there was clear misunderstanding and miscommunication. I believe what our ancestors offered the Lewis and Clark expedition was really an opportunity for respectful coexistence, that they knew the strangers were there, they knew the strangers were passing through, and they wanted to help them, provide them some assistance, and hopefully provide that promise of a way, another way of interacting with the people. When I was first asked to serve as a representative for the tribes and provide a tribal perspective on the Lewis and Clark expedition, I met with our tribal elders and I asked them what I should say and what I should tell the people. And at first they said, you know, this isn't a celebration for us. This is not something that we really want to participate in. This is not, these people to us were not great heroes. This was the beginning of an opening to our land, that this was the beginning of the cataloging of our resources and appropriation of those resources. And they talked among themselves, and some of those said, nope, we're not going to have anything to do with it. And the others said, think of our children. Think of what they will learn. Think about what they will know if our story isn't told. So the elders sat down and worked many countless hours and told the stories that they knew. They told hundreds of hours of stories, and those stories were recorded, and a draft was prepared, and the elders...
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a circular seal, speaking into a microphone. A water bottle and papers sit on the podium. Black fabric drapes form the background.
Have just released, and the Culture Committee has just released this book, The Salish People in the Lewis and Clark Expedition. It's really a telling of the tribal story. Thank you.
And if anyone has any questions for Germaine, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone around so everybody gets a chance to hear them. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, I'm sorry I came late. The Kootenai Salish now have a good oral history program, don't they?
Yes.
And the second part of that question is, if they do, does the communal memory and tradition of storytelling go back far enough to the Lewis and Clark expedition?
Thanks. That's such a great question. It reminds me of something that I left off that I had hoped to speak about. The tribe formed a cultural committee approximately 30 years ago. There were a group of middle-aged people in the mid-70s that were very concerned about the loss of language, culture, history, and many of them had been raised by traditional grandparents, and what they knew was that their children and their grandchildren were not able to communicate with the grandparents, that the older people spoke Salish, the young children spoke English, and there was a huge disconnect. So this group of middle-aged people that was very concerned and that were fluent language speakers asked the elders to come to a meeting and asked the elders for guidance and direction and said, what shall we do? Things are changing, we're afraid for our children, they're losing their language and their history. And the elders came together and they expressed an extraordinary sense of gratitude. They said, we've been carrying the burden of these stories and have looked for somebody to pass them on to. And we have these stories that were given to us by our elders, that was given to them by their ancestors. And we continue to carry them, but they hadn't seen anybody to pass them on to. So it was a wonderful nexus between the middle-aged people and the elders, and some very bright individual, and I don't know who it is, but some visionary chose to bring a tape recorder to the meeting and turn it on. So we have approximately 1,000 hours of recorded oral history interviews by elders that, many of them left us just after that time. So we've got about 1,000 hours of songs, about 1,000 hours of oral history. So when we began this project, not only did we...
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a microphone. A water bottle sits on the podium. Behind them is a black curtain backdrop. The setting appears to be an indoor presentation or speaking event.
Look at the oral history tapes, the taped interviews, but we also met with the elders we have today. In terms of time depth, most of those older elders had parents or grandparents that had lived during a time before there was significant non-tribal contact. So at that time, the stories were very intact, and we have many hours of coyote stories that tell about the formation of the place, all of the resources, the landmarks, how the animals came to be, incredible stories. So we have a rich archive of information. Great question. Oh, and just to answer your last question, some of the elders have commented on what they generally call openings, what it is when someone comes into tribal land and there's a consequent change in the traditional way of life. Pete Beaver had said, I believe it was in the mid-'70s, Pete Beaver had said they hadn't even seen our land yet, and already they'd taken it. Mitch Small Salmon said, they came and they set flags down on our land and claimed it, and yet it was already occupied. So there were some early accounts of what happened when early strangers came into Salish territory.
And did we have any other questions? Yep, all right.
Germaine, could you comment on the book by Peter Ronan, who was a trader around the turn of the 20th century, in which he talked about his time living with the Salish, and particularly he said that that William Clark had fathered a child with this Salish woman. And is that a story that's ongoing within the tribe, or was that a new book?
That is a story that's talked about. Yes, there. One of the culture committee staff said something about Lewis and Clark were the first deadbeat dads. They left a child behind that they did not provide for, and the Salish people did raise that child. And we have a picture of his grandchild in the book as well, Sakali Clark.
Germaine, can you talk about land ownership? I mean, there were territories amongst the other tribes you were competing, but what was the concept of owning land and land ownership in traditional times?
There wasn't a sense of ownership. We had
A person wearing a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a circular seal, speaking into a microphone. Black fabric drapes the background. They hold papers while looking downward.
a relationship with the landscape that was really very intimate. It was not, I'm guessing it's a lot like people that have had multi-generational farms. They take care of it because it was given to them by their parents or grandparents, and they hope to pass it on to their children. The land ownership, or the relationship between Salish people and the land, was really a very reciprocal relationship. It was based on reciprocity, and there was a great deal of abundance that was offered to the people, but it was all held communally. And as I said, at one time we were a very large band of Salish-speaking people, and we had primary camps along the Flathead River. We had primary camps in the Bitterroot Valley. We had a primary camp along the Sun River, in the Three Forks area. There were at one time there were both plateau and plains Salish people, so we were on both sides of the divide. In ecological terms, we talk about those areas, those biosystems where two different landscapes come together, like wetlands and grasslands or something like that. And for us, and those are extraordinarily rich and complex landscapes. For Salish people, we lived at the backbone of the world. We lived at the very beginning of the water, we lived at the very beginning of the resources, and we lived on both sides of the divide. So we hunted bison like plains people, we gathered roots like plateau people. It was like a smorgasbord. We took an abundance. We took from the abundance that was all around us, and we felt a great deal of people knew the landscape. The elders' lament now is that our children are like buffalo born behind a fence. They have no idea of the abundant landscape and the depth of relationship that people had traditionally. Kind of a long answer.
What was the name of the book that you mentioned right at the end on the Indian perspective? When was it printed?
It came out 2 weeks ago. It's published by University of Nebraska Press, and it's called The Salish People and the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Yeah. And I understand the press told us you can Google it.
A person in a light blue shirt stands at a wooden podium with a circular seal, speaking into a microphone. A white book rests on the podium. Black curtains hang behind them in what appears to be an indoor venue under a tent.
You can go to like Amazon.com and get copies of it, or you can just contact the tribes and we can, we have them as well. But I don't think I answered one of your questions. Did you ask me a complex question or a two-part question? Oh, okay.
The second topic I wanted to ask you about was the attitude of the Salish towards Clark's slave York, and whether he was treated any differently than anyone else on the expedition, as he was with some tribes. And I asked that because when Clark talked to Biddle about when they were preparing the journals, Clark had said that some tribes that had not had much personal encounter with Europeans didn't treat York any differently than anyone else.
York might have been the determining factor for one of the significant determining factors that allowed the expedition not to be eliminated when they entered Salish territory. The people were very, very curious about him. There's in our ceremonial way of life, there is a time where occasionally a transformation happens, and charcoal will be used to blacken the skin. And there was some question about whether or not this person was a great spiritual leader of the people, whether he was the most profoundly spiritual person and leader within the group. So there was some question whether or not that color would come off. They were very curious about him, extraordinarily curious about him.
And did we have any more questions for Germaine? Oh, yes we do. Good. All right.
I noticed that you had said that you considered that the Salish were related to other tribes in the area, but how did you regard the Blackfeet as being, it seems as if they were the sworn enemies of almost everybody around, but did you consider other native tribes like the Blackfeet to be related to Salish, or how was that?
No, we're distinct. There's no relationship. They have a completely separate language and history and culture. There's no relationship between Salish and Kootenai people and the Blackfeet people. I think it was De Smet that called Blackfeet the Hellhounds, the Rockies. They were.
A person in a light blue short-sleeved shirt stands at a wooden podium with a microphone and an open book. Behind them is a black curtain. The podium displays a circular seal or emblem.
They were fierce warriors. Occasionally we had temporary alliances, but traditionally they were our enemies. And it's complex to understand the need to protect resources for the well-being of the people, and how it is that when someone enters into your territory and makes an effort to capture those resources, how people will fiercely respond. I mean, if somebody came to your house to steal a child, I'm guessing you would be fierce in your retaliation of that individual. For Salish people, for Salish people, it was much the same. You know, the threat to the well-being of the people was powerful, and we are known to be very hospitable, very generous of spirit people, but we're also known to be extremely fierce adversaries. So the relationship between Blackfeet was primarily adversarial. And, you know, I really don't get this. You know, I don't get the whole notion of warfare. You know, maybe it's a gender thing, or I don't know. You know, maybe it's because I'm a mom. or an educator. And so maybe because I come from a people that are really very, very peaceful people, but so I don't get it. So I asked one of the elders, just to try to explain to me about warfare, because it doesn't make sense to me. It seems contradictory to everything about our culture. The extraordinary art we produced, the generosity, as I said, the love of children, the deep relationship with animals. So why did we go to war? And finally, in frustration, he said, it was a different time, Germaine. It was a different time. Probably now, people that were, great warriors that were admired for their courage, their strength, their bravery, would be in prison. So it's just, it's difficult for me to really explain about warfare and adversarial relationships very easily, and particularly about our relationship with Blackfeet. I tell my Blackfeet friends, don't take it personally, if some of my relatives seem less than welcoming. It's just this long historic relationship we have.
Well, let's thank Germaine again for joining us here in the 10 of Many Voices.
Thank you. Lemlemsh teles, lemlemsh pesia. Thank you.
And remember, there are programs here in the 10 of Many